The US-Japan trade deal is fake. And it always was going to be fake, but what surprises me and why I'm making this video is because I'm seeing a lot of people, especially Americans, believe that the version that the American president presented is actually how the deal is going to work, but it's not, so let's explain it. The highlight of the deal is supposed to be the $550 billion which Japan is supposedly going to invest into the US economy, and the 90% of the profits of these investments, which are supposedly going to go to the US. Right away we have two massive red flags here, one of them simple and one of them complicated. The simple red flag is that nobody is going to make an investment and then hand over 90% of the profits, right? That's just not going to happen. So even if you don't know what that 90% clause actually is referring to, you know right away that it isn't what the US president is presenting. And the more complicated one is that Japan was already going to invest more than $550 billion into the US economy, even without a trade deal. This is just current policy, but to understand why, it's a bit more complicated because it comes as a consequence of Japan having a current account surplus. See, some countries export more goods and services than they import, and this is called having a current account surplus. Japan in particular has a current account surplus of almost $200 billion per year. And so what do these exporting countries do with the money? Because they have to do something with the money, right? Nobody exports just to get to hold funny money fake paper. You have to buy something with it. Well, the money is used to purchase assets in other countries. And for the most part, companies and individuals from all countries buy assets in all countries, but the countries that have a current account surplus buy more assets on foreign soil than are being bought on their soil by foreigners, and countries that have a current account deficit sell off more of the assets on their own soil than they buy on the soil of other countries. So in 2024, Japan had a current account surplus of almost $200 billion, which means that in 2024, Japan acquired assets worth $200 billion in other countries, aka invested $200 billion abroad in foreign economies. In the same year, the US had a current account deficit of over $1.1 trillion, and this means that the US actually accounts for about 60% of the sum total of all current account deficits of all countries that run a current account deficit. And so for any given net exporter, if their investments are spread out evenly across all the countries that run a deficit, then you would expect about 60% of those investments to be going into the USA, just under business as usual policies, right? So again, Japan makes a product, Japan sells that product to Americans, Japan gets the money, Japan uses the money to buy stakes in American companies, and they do this likely to the tune of about $100 billion per year. I haven't looked up what it actually is, but it's at least tens of billions guaranteed. So what does this tell you? Well, it tells you that Japan can make good on its commitment of $550 billion investment in the USA without changing literally anything in their current policy. $550 billion, if taken over a 10-year basis, which is how US laws are typically calculated, is sort of peanuts compared to how much Japan invests in foreign economies on an ongoing basis. And again, most of that investment already goes into the USA. Again, no change in Japan's current policy, which is strike one for the deal being fake. Now let's focus more on the 90% part, because again, anybody with two working brain cells is going to be able to tell you that the USA does not have the leverage to get any country to hand over 90% of its profits, let alone a country like Japan, so it cannot possibly mean what the headline is trying to imply. But luckily, there's something very close to what the headline is implying that could easily lead to the US retaining 90% of the profits, which is that the US would also supply 90% of the financing. Basically, this would mean that there are a total of $5.5 trillion of projects in question. $5.5 trillion of investment that would be occurring in total, and 10% of that, $550 billion, would come from Japan, while the other 90% would come from US investors. And so the US makes 90% of the investments into the investment project, gets 90% of the shares in the investment project, and thus gets 90% of the profits from the investment project. Everyone keeps their fair share of the profits according to current policy, and that's strike 2 for the deal being fake. Now I want to make a distinction. Everything that I've said so far, this is all stuff that should have instantly run through your head the moment you read the first articles about this deal. Right before getting any confirmation that it's fake, these are very straightforward ways in which it looks fake, and the USA in particular is on a spree of making nothing burger deals that just put current policy into new wording. And coincidentally, the deal under this discussion also happens to be 2 or 3 words of ambiguity away from just being the same thing, current policy in new words. And so your immediate thought should have been that this is just a continuation of current policy and the US president is wasting my time as a reader. Now let's see the news that we got after the headline. Okay, let's see the clarifications. First, Japan confirmed that the $550 billion of investment part of the deal would come in the form of equity investments by Japanese firms into their operations on US soil, which is literally business as usual in Japanese FDI. That's how you run a branch of a company that you own on foreign soil. You have to constantly invest in it, so that confirms our strike 1. It's actually even more restrictive than the version I presented. And 2 days later, Japan confirmed that the US will share 90% of profits from joint investment with Japan because the US will take on a proportional share of the risk and financing. Literally just business as usual in how joint investments work. So that confirms our strike 2, except combined with the first clarification, if that is strictly speaking correct, that's even better for Japan because it just restricts it to Japanese companies having operations on US soil. So what does this tell us about deals that the US may make in the future? Because Japan is one of the biggest net exporters in the world, which means that they're one of the biggest investors in the USA, but the biggest net exporter in the world is actually the European Union, as measured as a single economy with respect to the rest of the world. The European Union actually exports almost 3 times more net exports than Japan does, and so when you think that the American nothing burger fry cooks are currently in Europe, trying to get a deal here too, you have to wonder, are we just going to see a repeat of the Japan deal? So instead of $550 billion fake deal, a $1.5 trillion fake deal? This is the sort of fakery that you should expect to be coming out of the Europe deal as well, if a Europe deal is arrived at. And this is the same fakery that we saw the US pull in the Middle East, the same fakery that we saw the US pull in Ukraine. They always promise something that everyone with 2 working brain cells knows isn't going to work, and then when it doesn't work, they declare victory anyway. I'm telling you all of this because if you're not American and you're still plugged in to the US news cycle, it's literally frying your brain for nothing. And there was a window of time early in 2025 when I thought that maybe I'm crazy, right? Maybe T-Man has some cards up his sleeve and that's why he's talking so confidently, but turns out that no. T-Man only has the cards that all of us already know about, and he's so confident about stuff that cannot be possibly achieved because he knows that even when he fails, he'll just declare victory anyway, and the Americans will eat up the propaganda. In reality, nothing ever happens, and I've completely disconnected from this news cycle. I check in maybe once a week. Literally, you're better off spending that time watching cat videos, or even watching my videos. Thank you for watching my videos, like and subscribe. And as I was editing that, the Europe deal dropped as well, and it's another nothing burger. Of course, we have the 600 billion of fake investment. We also have 750 billion of oil and gas purchases, which is another nothing burger, but for a bit of an interesting reason. See, the way that US oil and gas extraction work is that they are generated mostly on the East Coast, and Europe is a very close destination. So for example, when it comes to LNG, all LNG is the same, so hypothetically, you could have like a world where American LNG goes to China through the Panama Canal or around the South America, and Qatari LNG goes to Europe through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea blockade or around the tip of Africa. But doing this would be stupid, right? And so instead what happens is that US LNG always goes to Europe unless the European market is saturated, and Qatari LNG is always going to go to China unless the Chinese market is saturated. And this is true to such an extent meant that you could even hypothetically have a situation where Europe only has contracts with Qatari companies and China only has contracts with American companies. This is what we call commercial exchanges, and the physical routes would likely remain the same. So it's just another thing that could never be any other way. When it comes to oil, it's a different story, although it's a bit different. All LNG is the same. For technical reasons, it's technically a manufactured product because natural gas cannot be liquefied, so it has to be purified into pure methane instead. That's what LNG is. But crude oil is a natural product, and you have heavier grades and lighter grades. The US shale crude is remarkably light, but the US fleet of refineries were built in the pre-shale era, so they're tuned for heavier grades. And what happens when you put the wrong grade in the wrong refinery is that the refinery gets derated. Now the US actually has a shortage of refineries, so it cannot afford to derate unless it wants to build a bunch of brand new refineries. But the EU actually has a huge surplus of refineries, more than what you'll actually find by googling it, because I'm pretty sure that like a quarter of them are mothballed, so they do not show up in the current installed capacity, but they're there. And so the EU can afford to derate all it wants, and so it's happy to take American crude while America imports heavier crude from other parts of the world. And again, the shortness of the route and the open ocean doesn't hurt either. All that to say that under current policy, US oil and gas goes to Europe, and there's no other way it could have been, making this section of the deal also a nothing burger because it's no change to current policy. Obviously, both of these deals are not legally binding, and both of them might get entirely scrapped if the tariffs themselves are found by US courts to be illegal. Factually speaking, they are illegal, but the Supreme Kangaroo Court might disagree. And with that, I'm out for real this time. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe.